The great house was a tomb. It stood on that hill, a monument of cold stone and forgotten sorrows, its windows like 100 blind eyes staring out over the endless fields of white cotton. This was the kingdom of Blaze. A man who owned more land, more cotton, and more secrets than any man for 100 miles in any direction. Out in the town, they called him the Cotton Baron. They whispered about his wealth, his sharp tongue, his temper. They said he had a storm raging in his heart where a man's soul ought to be. And they weren't wrong. His money was a fortress. The walls were high. The gates were locked. He'd spent a lifetime building them, not to keep folks out, but to keep the crushing loneliness in. The only sound in those grand, empty halls was the echo of his own footsteps, a constant hollow beat reminding him that all the money in the world can't buy a single shred of happiness. You see, Blaze wasn't born this way. Something had happened. A story he kept under lock and key, buried deep in the coldest part of his heart. Years ago, a woman had promised him forever. And then, just as quickly, she'd ripped that promise away, choosing a man with a more glittering title, a better name. She left Blaze with nothing but the jagged, bitter truth that he wasn't enough. And that rejection? It didn't just break his heart. It froze it solid. The hopeful young man died that day, and this cold, hard Baron took his place. He decided if he couldn't be loved, he would be feared. He trusted numbers in a ledger, because they never lied. He trusted land, because it never left. People, though? Their hearts were made of glass, and their promises were even more fragile. Then she arrived. Her name was Scarlett. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, a woman as tough as old leather but surprisingly fair, hired her on a Tuesday. Scarlett was young, but her eyes held a kind of knowing, a gentle wisdom that didn't belong on a face so fresh. Life had already dealt her a bad hand. She'd lost her whole family to a fever that swept through her village. But that loss hadn't made her bitter. It had made her strong. It had hammered her faith into something unbreakable. She believed, deep down, that there was a plan. That even in the deepest, darkest night, a little kindness could be a lantern. She didn't want much. Just to be useful. She moved through that cold, grand house like a whisper, dusting books that were never opened, polishing silver that was never used, sweeping floors that never felt a visitor's footstep. And as she worked, she'd see him. The master of the house, Blaze. A silhouette against his study window, staring at a horizon he couldn't see. She saw the lines etched on his face, not by years, but by the crushing weight of his own spirit. He wasn't a monster to her. He was just sad. A ship without a rudder, lost on a dark and endless sea. So, in the quiet of her work, without telling a soul, she started to pray for him. Little whispered prayers for the peace he couldn't seem to find for himself. One afternoon, the air in the house felt heavier than usual. She was cleaning the long hallway by the main staircase, the one lined with the portraits of dead ancestors, all staring down with disapproving eyes. The silence was so thick you could feel it pressing in on you. To chase away the gloom, to comfort her own soul, she started to hum. An old, simple hymn her mother had taught her. A song about grace. About finding your way back from the dark. Her voice was quiet, but in that silent tomb of a house, it was a revolution. A warmth that hadn't been felt in those halls for years. She was so lost in her work, so wrapped up in the simple tune, that she never heard the study door creak open behind her. Blaze stood there, frozen. The sound. It was so pure, so unexpected. It cut through the fog in his mind like a lightning strike. For one single, solitary second, it touched a part of him he thought had died and turned to dust years ago. A place that remembered softness, that remembered light. But that feeling was so strange, so terrifyingly vulnerable, that his defenses came crashing back into place like a portcullis slamming shut. The warmth vanished, replaced by an ice-cold fury. A rage directed not at the girl, but at himself, for the weakness of feeling anything at all. His voice cut through the air like a shard of glass. "You, the new girl." Scarlet jumped, her cleaning cloth dropping to the polished floor. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. His face was a mask of cold fury. "This is a place of work," he snapped, his words clipped and brutal. "It is not a concert hall. I will not have that noise disturbing the peace of my house. Keep your songs to yourself." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "Is that understood?" The cruelty of it was like a physical blow. Heat flooded her cheeks, a mix of shame and hurt. She hadn't meant any harm. She was just trying to make the world a little less lonely. She stared at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. But then, something shifted inside her. That quiet, unbreakable strength. The faith that had seen her through worse days than this. She would not fight his fire with more fire. Slowly, she bent down and picked up her cloth. She stood up straight, lifted her chin, and met his icy glare. Her eyes were wet, but they held no fear, only a quiet, unshakable dignity. "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice was soft, but it didn't tremble. "I understand." She gave a small, respectful nod, then turned her back on him and returned to her work. The humming was gone, but her spirit was not. She continued polishing the grand wooden banister, her movements steady, calm, deliberate. Blaze watched her for another long moment, thrown completely off balance. He'd expected tears. He'd expected her to cower. He had not expected this quiet strength. He had won. He had pushed her away. He had restored the silence. But as he stalked back into his study and slammed the door, the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. The silence he had demanded was back, but it was different now. It was heavier, louder, and the ghost of her simple hymn hung in the air, a melody that made his fortress of a house feel more like a prison than ever before. The walls were still standing, but a tiny hairline crack had just appeared, and through it, a sliver of light was starting to push its way in. But that crack in the wall was about to reveal a secret far darker than simple loneliness. Because the song she had hummed was not just any song. It was a song he hadn't heard in 10 years. The last person he'd heard sing that tune was the woman who had shattered his world. Alara. The thought hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back to his desk, sinking into his chair. Coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. A common hymn. Nothing more. But his heart hammered in his chest, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. He had built his entire life around forgetting her, around burying the memory so deep it could never hurt him again. And this new girl, this Maid, had just dug it up with a few simple notes. The silence he demanded now felt like a living thing, mocking him. He strained his ears, half hoping, half dreading to hear the humming start again. But there was nothing. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of his empty life. He tried to bury himself in his ledgers, in the neat columns of numbers that always made sense, but his eyes kept drifting to a small, locked rosewood box on his mantelpiece, a box he hadn't opened in a decade. Meanwhile, Scarlet went about her duties, her calm exterior a perfect mask for the turmoil inside. His cruelty had stung, but it had also sparked something else. Curiosity. A man doesn't react with that much venom to a simple song unless that song means something. She saw the way he looked now, the new layer of torment in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The way he pushed his food around his plate at dinner, his appetite gone. The compassion she felt for him was still there, but now it was mixed with a thread of suspicion. What was the real story of this place? The answer, it turned out, was not hidden in a locked box, but in the heart of the house itself. A few days later, Mrs. Higgins tasked her with cleaning the long abandoned east wing. "The master hasn't set foot in here for years," the housekeeper said, her voice unusually soft. "Be thorough, but be respectful." The air in the east wing was stale and thick with dust. The furniture was all shrouded in white cloths, like rows of pale ghosts. In what must have been a lady's sitting room, Scarlett found it. Behind a heavy tapestry depicting a hunting scene, there was a small, almost invisible door. It wasn't locked. Her heart pounded as she pushed it open. It was a tiny room, more of a closet, really. And on a small writing desk, covered in a thick blanket of dust, was a leather-bound diary. Her hands trembled as she wiped away the dust from the cover. Embossed in faded gold leaf was a single initial. E. She knew she shouldn't. It was an unforgivable invasion of privacy. But the secrets of this house were calling to her. She opened the diary to a random page. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. But the words were filled with a desperate fear. He is not the man I thought he was. The temper, the darkness inside him. It frightens me. I see the way he looks at me sometimes, not with love, but with possession. I feel like a bird in a beautiful cage. Today he found me humming that old hymn, and his face. It was a monster's face. I have to get away. I have to find a way out before the cage door locks for good. Scarlett slammed the book shut, her blood running cold. This was Alara's diary, and it painted a picture not of a man left heartbroken, but of a monster who had driven a woman away in terror. Was this the truth? Was the sad, lonely man she prayed for actually a dangerous predator? She stood there in the silent, dusty room, the diary feeling like a lead weight in her hands. She had come to this house seeking peace, a place to serve. And she had just stumbled into the middle of a nightmare. The fortress walls Blaze had built were not to keep loneliness in. They were to keep a terrible secret from getting out. Scarlett put the diary back exactly where she found it, her mind reeling. Every interaction she'd had with Blaze now seemed sinister. His coldness, his explosive anger over the song. It wasn't just bitterness. It was the reaction of a guilty man. A man terrified of his past being exposed. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She was living under the roof of a man who might be capable of anything. Her work was no longer a comfort. It was a performance. She kept her head down, her movements quiet, avoiding him at all costs. But the house felt different now. The shadows seemed longer, the silence more menacing. She saw him less, as he seemed to confine himself almost entirely to his study. But she felt his presence everywhere, a dark cloud hanging over the estate. A week later, the storm broke. Literally. A fierce, howling gale swept across the plains, rattling the windows and lashing the house with sheets of rain. Blaze, in a fit of stubborn pride, had insisted on riding out to check on a section of fencing miles away, ignoring the warnings of his stable hands. He returned hours later, not just soaked, but ghostly pale, shivering so violently his teeth chattered. By nightfall, he was in the grip of a raging fever. Mrs. Higgins sent for the doctor, who came and went, leaving behind bitter medicines and grave warnings. "Keep him warm, keep him quiet," he'd said. "This fever will either break him or break on its own." But it didn't break. It tightened its hold, dragging Blaze down into a delirious nightmare. He tossed and turned, his voice a hoarse rasp, crying out names and phrases that made no sense. The other servants were terrified. They were already scared of him when he was well. Sick and raving, he was like a creature from a horror story. They left food outside his door and scurried away. It was Mrs. Higgins who approached Scarlett, her face etched with worry. "The others won't go near him," she said, her voice low. "He needs someone to watch over him, to get some broth into him. You have a steady nerve, child. Will you do it?" Scarlett's first instinct was to say no, to run. The thought of being alone in a room with that man, the man from the diary, made her skin crawl. But then she looked at Mrs. Higgins's desperate face, and another thought pushed its way through her fear. Her faith. What was it worth if it vanished at the first sign of trouble? I only did what was right, she had told herself before. This was a human being, sick and helpless, regardless of what he'd done. And more than that, a terrible, chilling idea began to form in her mind. A sick man, a man lost in delirium, might just talk. He might just confess. She took a deep breath. I'll do it. She entered his room like a soldier entering a battlefield. The air was hot and suffocating, thick with the smell of sickness. For 3 days and nights, she was a ghost at his bedside. She bathed his burning forehead with cool cloths. She patiently spooned water and broth between his cracked, dry lips. And when he thrashed in the grip of his nightmares, she would read from her small Bible, her voice a low, steady murmur, a lifeline of calm in his storm-tossed mind. He was mostly unaware of her, lost in his own private hell. But on the 3rd night, his eyes flew open. They were wild, unfocused, staring at something only he could see. He began to speak, his voice terrifyingly clear in the quiet room. Alara, he rasped, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. His grip was like iron. Alara, you can't leave. Don't you see? I did it for us. Scarlet froze, her blood turning to ice. He was going to take you from me, Blaze continued, his eyes locked on her face, but seeing someone else entirely. Your brother, Silas. He was never going to let us be together. I told him to stay away. He wouldn't listen. Blaze's breath hitched, a dry sob tearing from his throat. It was an accident. The fall. I never meant for it to happen. I swear it. I only wanted to frighten him. His grip on her wrist tightened until it was painful. You have to believe me, Alara. You have to. And then, his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed back onto the pillows unconscious. Scarlet stood there, her entire body trembling, the imprint of his fingers burning on her wrist. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. An accident. He had killed Alara's brother. He wasn't just a brute who drove a woman away. He was a killer. And she was trapped in his house, the only one who knew his secret. The fever wasn't just a sickness anymore. It was a race. If he died, the secret might die with him. But if he lived, what would he do to the woman who had heard his confession? The next morning, the fever broke. Blaze woke up weak, hollowed out, but clear-headed for the first time in days. The first thing he saw was Scarlet, slumped in the chair by his bed, fast asleep. Her Bible was open on her lap. He saw the exhausted shadows under her eyes, the way her hand rested near his on the coverlet. And the memories came flooding back. Not the sharp, terrifying nightmares, but the moments in between. A cool cloth on his brow, a steady hand guiding a cup to his lips. And a voice. A quiet, calm voice reading words of comfort that had pierced through his delirium and kept the worst of the darkness at bay. This was the girl he had terrorized in the hallway, the one whose simple song had dredged up a decade of pain. And she had stayed by his side. She had nursed him. She had, in all likelihood, saved his life. A wave of shame so hot and powerful it took his breath away washed over him. He had been at his absolute weakest, and the only person who had shown him an ounce of human kindness was the one he had treated with such casual cruelty. Later that day, when he was strong enough to sit up, he asked Mrs. Higgins who had cared for him. It was Scarlet, sir, the housekeeper said, a rare note of pride in her voice. She never left your side. I believe we'd have lost you without her. He found her in the kitchen garden, gathering herbs. When his shadow fell over her, she looked up, and for a split second, he saw raw fear in her eyes before she masked it. The sight of that fear he had put there, was like a knife in his gut. Scarlet, he said, his voice still hoarse. It felt strange to say her name. I am told I owe you my life. He struggled for the words. I remember your voice, reading to me. He took a breath. And I remember I was unkind to you, before. For that I am truly sorry. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. She was searching for something in his face. He didn't know what it was. There is nothing to forgive, sir, she said, her voice flat, emotionless. It wasn't the simple grace he'd half expected. It was something else, a careful, guarded wall. I'm glad to see you recovered. The wall she had put up was a mirror of his own, and it terrified him. He felt an overwhelming urge to tear it down, to connect with this person who had seen him at his absolute worst. I was wondering, he began, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. The doctor says I need fresh air. I was wondering if you would allow me to join you on your evening walk. Scarlett stared at him for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable. He could see the conflict warring in her eyes. The fear, the suspicion, and something else. Maybe the last remnants of the compassion she'd once felt. For her, this wasn't an invitation. It was a test. A dangerous, terrifying test. To refuse might anger him. To accept meant walking alone into the wilderness with a man she believed was a killer. I walked to the old oak at the edge of the north meadow, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. As the sun sets. It wasn't a yes, it was a statement of fact. But for Blaze, it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and slowly walked back to the house. A gate had been opened, and he had invited her in. He didn't know that for Scarlett. Walking through that gate felt like stepping into a lion's den. She had heard his confession. Now he wanted to get her alone. Her heart pounded with a single, terrifying question. Was he trying to thank her, or was he trying to silence her for good? Their first walk was the most tense hour of Scarlett's life. The setting sun bled across the sky, but she felt none of its warmth. She was acutely aware of every rustle in the grass, every shadow that stretched and grew long. She walked with a careful distance between them, her body coiled like a spring, ready to run. Blaze, weakened by his illness, leaned on a cane, and for that, she was grateful. He was in no condition to chase her. He tried to make conversation. He talked about the cotton, the weather, the land. His voice was different, quieter than she'd ever heard it. He was trying to be gentle. But to Scarlett, it was all part of a monstrous act. Every polite question felt like a trap. Every observation about the scenery felt like a lie, designed to lull her into a false sense of security. She gave short, non-committal answers, her eyes constantly scanning the path ahead, her mind racing, planning her escape route. He seemed to sense her fear. Scarlett, he said, stopping near a cluster of old trees. You seem anxious. Are you still afraid of me? Her heart leaped into her throat. This was it, the confrontation. I have no reason to be, sir, she lied, her voice barely a whisper. He sighed, a sound of deep, genuine sadness. Yes, you do. I was a brute to you, and I can't explain why, not yet, but I swear to you on my honor that you are safe with me. I would never, ever harm you. His words were so earnest, his eyes so full of what looked like sincere regret, that for a moment her resolve wavered. The man from the fevered confession and the man standing before her seemed like two completely different people. Could she have misunderstood? Could she have heard wrong? But the memory of his iron grip on her wrist, of the name Silas spoken with such venom, came rushing back. No. She had heard what she had heard. These walks became a nightly ritual, a dangerous dance of secrets and suspicion. He slowly regained his strength, and with it, her fear grew. He talked more about himself, but always in vague terms. He spoke of loneliness, of a past mistake that had cost him everything. He was testing her, she thought, probing to see what she knew, and she played her part, listening politely, a quiet, unassuming maid. But every night, after she returned to the safety of her small room, she would lie awake, her mind racing. What was his plan? Why was he keeping her close? One evening, a sudden downpour forced them to take shelter under the sprawling branches of the great oak tree at the edge of the meadow. They were trapped together in the small, green-lit space, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the leaves above them. The polite distance between them was gone. He was so close she could feel the heat from his body. He chose that moment to finally open the door to his past. Her name was Alara, he said, his voice low, almost lost in the sound of the storm. He told her the story she already knew, but his version was different. He painted Alara as a tragic victim, not of him, but of her family. He spoke of a cruel brother, Silas, who saw her as a pawn in a business deal. He told her of a love that was forbidden, a plan to run away together. He told her everything, except the ending. She just disappeared, he finished, his voice breaking. One day she was there, the next she was gone. Her family said she ran off with another man. I never believed it, but I never knew what happened. He turned to her, his eyes pleading. That's the burden I carry, Scarlett. Not just losing her, but the not knowing. It has haunted me every day for 10 years. It was a masterful performance. He was twisting the story, painting himself as the victim, the heartbroken lover. He was trying to see if his new version would stick, if she would believe it. Scarlett felt a cold fury rise within her. He was lying to her face, trying to manipulate her. That's a very sad story, sir, she said, her voice carefully neutral. His face fell. He had expected sympathy, maybe even a tear. He had not expected this cool, detached response. The air between them grew thick with unspoken words. The rain stopped as suddenly as it began. They walked back to the house in a heavy, suffocating silence. Scarlett knew the game had changed. He had shown her his hand, and she hadn't bought it. The pretense of friendship was over. Now she was truly in danger. That night, she decided she couldn't wait for him to make his move. She had to find proof. Something more concrete than a fevered confession. Something she could use to protect herself. She waited until the house was dark and silent, until the only sound was the ticking of the clocks. Then, her heart pounding, she crept out of her room and down the long, dark hallway towards his study. The door was locked. Of course, it was. But during her endless hours of cleaning, she had learned the secrets of the house. She knew Mrs. Higgins kept a ring of old skeleton keys in the pantry. Praying the housekeeper was a sound sleeper, Scarlett slipped down the back stairs. She found the keys, her hands trembling so hard she could barely fit the right one into the study door. With a soft click, the lock turned. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and him. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, painting silver stripes across the floor. She didn't know what she was looking for. A letter? A weapon? She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the small rosewood box on the mantelpiece. The one he never touched, the one that seemed to radiate a cold energy. It was locked, a small, intricate brass lock. She tried the keys, but none of them fit. Desperate, she picked it up, shaking it gently. Something slid inside. She worked at the latch with a letter opener from his desk, her breath held tight in her chest. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock broke. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a stack of old love letters. It was not a withered flower or a lock of hair. It was a small, tarnished silver locket. And a single yellowed newspaper clipping. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the clipping. The date was from 10 years ago. The headline was small, buried in the back pages of the paper. Local man, Silas Blackwood, Perishes in Tragic Riding Accident. The article was short. It said he was found at the bottom of a ravine on the edge of his property, the very same property that bordered Blaze's land. A riding accident. That's what they called it. Blaze had called it the fall. Her blood ran cold. He hadn't just gotten into a fight with Silas. He had killed him and made it look like an accident. He was a murderer. A cold, calculating murderer who had gotten away with it. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She had to get out. Now. She opened the locket. She expected to see a picture of Alara, but the face that stared back at her was achingly familiar. It was a miniature portrait of a young woman with warm, kind eyes and dark, curly hair. It was a perfect portrait of her own mother. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Her mother? Alara? The dates matched. Her mother had died 10 years ago, supposedly from a fever, just a few weeks after that newspaper was printed. Her father, heartbroken, had followed soon after. That's what she'd always been told. But this changed everything. The story of the fever was a lie. Her mother hadn't died of a sickness. She had been Alara, the woman Blaze claimed to love. The woman who had disappeared. Had her mother run away from Blaze, only to die? Or had Blaze found her? Had he killed her too, to keep his secret safe? And the most terrifying question of all, the one that echoed in the silent study like a scream. Did Blaze know who she was? Had he hired her, brought her into his house, not by chance, but by design? Was this whole thing, the sickness, the walks, the confession, an elaborate, cruel game? She stood there, clutching the locket, her entire life a lie, her past a crime scene. She was not just a maid who had stumbled upon a secret. She was the daughter of the woman he had destroyed. And she was trapped in the house of her family's killer. Scarlett stumbled back from the desk, the locket clutched in her hand, her mind a screaming chaos of questions. Her mother was Alara. The gentle, loving mother she remembered from her childhood was the woman at the center of this dark, violent mystery. The fever, the story that had defined her entire life as an orphan, was a lie, a cover story. But for what? She looked at the newspaper clipping again. Tragic riding accident. And Blaze's own words from his delirium. The fall. I never meant for it to happen. He had killed her uncle Silas, a man she'd never even known she had. Blaze wasn't just a murderer. He was the architect of her entire family's destruction. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Terror seized her. She shoved the locket and the clipping into her apron pocket, snapped the rosewood box shut, and scrambled to put it back on the mantelpiece. She flew across the room, slipping out of the study and pulling the door silently shut just as footsteps reached the top of the main staircase. She pressed herself into the shadows of the hallway, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. It was Mrs. Higgins, doing a final round of the house. Scarlett held her breath, praying the old woman wouldn't notice the faint scratch on the study door or the broken lock on the box. The housekeeper passed by without a glance and disappeared down the stairs. Scarlett sagged against the wall, slick with cold sweat. It was a close call. Too close. She knew she couldn't stay. To remain in this house was a death sentence. He would find out what she knew, who she was. He would silence her, just as he had silenced everyone else. Her plan was simple and desperate. Wait for the dawn, slip out of the house, and run. Run as far and as fast as she could. But as she lay in her bed, staring into the darkness, the image of her mother's face in the locket burned in her mind. To run would be to let him win. To let him keep his secrets, his land, his life, all built on the ruins of her family. The quiet faith that had guided her was now forged into something harder, sharper. It was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. The next day, she didn't run. She stayed. She put on her uniform, pinned on her polite, subservient expression, and walked back into the lion's den. But now, she was not the prey. She was the hunter. Her new mission gave her a strange, terrifying clarity. She watched him across the dinner table, this man who was her mother's lover and her uncle's killer. She listened to his polite conversation, every word a drop of poison. He seemed calmer today, as if a weight had been lifted. He thought his story about the disappearance had worked. He thought she was a foolish, sympathetic girl he could control. He had no idea he was sitting across from the one person on Earth who could destroy him. She needed more than just a locket and a clipping. She needed irrefutable proof. The answer, she realized, had to be with the only other person who had been there through it all. Mrs. Higgins. The housekeeper was fiercely loyal to Blaze, but she was also a deeply religious woman with a rigid sense of right and wrong. If Scarlett could just plant a seed of doubt. She found her opportunity that afternoon. While helping the housekeeper mend linens, she began to talk, her voice filled with a carefully crafted innocence. "It's so tragic about the master's past," she sighed. "That poor woman, Alara. To just vanish like that. I pray she found peace." Mrs. Higgins's needle stopped. "Some things are best left in the past, child." "I know," Scarlett said, looking down at her sewing. "It's just, he seems so certain she left him. But in the diary I found, it sounded like she was afraid of him, like she was the one who needed to get away." The color drained from Mrs. Higgins's face. "What diary?" she whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. "The one in the East Wing," Scarlett said softly. "The one where she talks about his temper, and about a fight with her brother." She looked up, her eyes wide and guileless. "It made me wonder, what if she didn't run away at all? She had planted the seed. She could see it taking root in the housekeeper's eyes, the old certainties starting to crumble. Mrs. Higgins knew more than she let on. Scarlett was sure of it. That evening, Blaze requested she join him for their walk as usual. This time, Scarlett agreed without hesitation. She needed to keep him close, to keep him believing he was in control. As they walked toward the old oak tree, the very spot where he had spun his lies, she decided to push him. "Sir," she said, her voice soft, "I have been thinking about your story, about Alara." "Have you?" he asked, a small, pleased smile on his face. "Yes, it must be so difficult, not knowing. Have you ever considered that her brother, Silas, might have had something to do with her disappearance? If he was so cruel, perhaps he forced her away." Blaze stopped dead in his tracks. His smile vanished. His face became a cold, hard mask. "Silas is dead," he said, his voice flat. "He died in an accident. It has nothing to do with this." "But what if it wasn't an accident?" Scarlett pressed, her heart hammering. "What if someone hurt him to get him out of the way?" He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her take an involuntary step back. The gentle, melancholic man was gone. In his place was the monster from the diary. Cold, dangerous. "You are asking too many questions, Scarlett," he said, his voice a low growl. "You are a maid. Remember your place." He knew. Somehow, he knew she was getting too close. The game was up. He turned and stalked back toward the house, leaving her standing alone in the fading light. The threat was no longer veiled. It was out in the open. She had poked the beast, and now it was awake. She ran back to the house, not toward the front door, but around to the servants' entrance, her mind screaming. She had to get the locket. She had to get out. But when she burst into her small room, she froze. The door was ajar, and the room had been ransacked. Her thin mattress was slashed open, its stuffing pulled out. Her few belongings were tossed across the floor. Her hiding spot, the loose floorboard under her bed, was pried open. The locket and the newspaper clipping were gone. And standing in the center of the chaos, her face a grim, pale mask, was Mrs. Higgins. "He knows," the housekeeper whispered, her voice trembling. He knows you were in his study. He's looking for you. Before Scarlet could process what was happening, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Blaze. He was coming for her. There's no time, Mrs. Higgins hissed, grabbing Scarlet's arm with a strength that belied her age. Come with me. Now. She didn't drag her towards the stairs, towards escape. She pulled her deeper into the servants' quarters, towards a narrow, dark passageway Scarlet had never noticed before. It leads to the old cellars, Mrs. Higgins explained, pushing a hidden panel in the wall. He won't think to look for you here. Go, hide, and do not make a sound. Scarlet scrambled into the pitch-black opening, the smell of damp earth and decay filling her lungs. The panel slid shut behind her, plunging her into absolute darkness. She could hear Blaze's furious voice on the other side of the wall, shouting her name. She was trapped, buried alive in the foundations of the house, with a murderer hunting her just a few feet away. And the only person who knew where she was the woman who had been his loyal servant for 30 years. Was Mrs. Higgins saving her? Or had she just led her into a tomb? The darkness was total, suffocating. Scarlet pressed her ear against the cold stone wall, listening to the muffled sounds of Blaze's rage. He was tearing the servants' quarters apart. She heard furniture splintering, his voice a raw, animalistic roar. He knew she had found his secret, and he was not going to let her escape. Hours passed. The sounds from above eventually faded, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. Was he gone? Or was he waiting, listening for the slightest sound from the cellar? Scarlet stayed frozen in the darkness, every nerve screaming. Mrs. Higgins had pushed her in here. But was it a sanctuary or a prison? The housekeeper's loyalty was a mystery. Had she turned on her master of 30 years? Or was this an elaborate trap? Just as she was about to give in to despair, a faint scratching sound came from the panel. A sliver of lantern light cut through the blackness. The panel slid open, and Mrs. Higgins stood there, her face grim. He's gone out with the overseers, she whispered urgently. He thinks you ran for the woods. We don't have much time. She helped Scarlet out of the cramped space and led her not to the exit, but to her own small, tidy room. She bolted the door and turned to face Scarlet, her eyes filled with a terrible sadness. I have served this family my whole life, she began, her voice shaking. I loved his father. I practically raised Blaze myself. I watched him turn from a good boy into this. She wrung her hands. I always knew something was wrong about what happened to Alara and her brother. Blaze said she ran away, and Silas died in an accident a week later. It was too neat, too convenient, but I held my tongue. I was loyal. I was a coward. She looked at Scarlet, her gaze intense. But when you told me about the diary, and when I saw the look on his face tonight, I knew. I knew you were right, and I cannot let him hurt you too. I will not have another death on my conscience. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. He didn't just drive Alara away. He hunted her. Scarlet's blood ran cold. What do you mean? After Silas's accident, Alara ran, Mrs. Higgins explained, her words tumbling out. She didn't run to another man. She ran home, to her parents. But Blaze couldn't let her go. He saw her as his possession. He went after her. He dragged her back here. He locked her in the East Wing, telling everyone she'd gone mad with grief. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more horrific than Scarlet could have imagined. Her mother hadn't died of a fever. She had been a prisoner in this very house. What happened to her? Scarlet whispered, dreading the answer. Mrs. Higgins's eyes filled with tears. He broke her spirit. After a few weeks, she took her own life. In that dusty room where you found the diary. Blaze told the doctor it was the fever that took her. He bought the silence of everyone involved. He buried her in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property, telling the world she had simply vanished. Scarlet felt the floor drop out from under her. Her mother, imprisoned, driven to despair. It was a pain so immense it was almost physical. The man she had been nursing, praying for, was a monster beyond comprehension. He hadn't just killed her uncle. He had tortured and destroyed her mother. He found the locket, Mrs. Higgins said, her voice barely audible. He found it when he searched your room. He knows who you are, Scarlett. He knows you are Alara's daughter. The full, terrifying truth of her situation crashed down on her. Blaze wasn't just trying to hide a 10-year-old crime. He was trying to eliminate the last living link to his victims. He would not stop until she was silenced, just like her mother. "We have to go to the sheriff," Scarlett said, her voice shaking but firm. "We have to tell them everything." Mrs. Higgins shook her head sadly. "The sheriff? He's in Blaze's pocket. So is the judge. They'd never believe us. A maid and a housekeeper against the most powerful man in the county? They would lock us up in an asylum." She looked at Scarlett, a desperate plan forming in her eyes. "There is only one way. We have to find the proof he can't deny. We have to find where he buried your mother." The idea was insane. To search for a secret grave on the property of a man who was actively hunting them. It was a suicide mission. But as Scarlett looked at the determined face of the old housekeeper, she knew it was their only chance. Justice wouldn't be found in a courtroom. It would have to be clawed from the very earth of this cursed estate. "He always avoids the old pecan grove by the creek," Mrs. Higgins said, her mind working quickly. "He hasn't been there in years. It's overgrown, forgotten. If he buried her anywhere, it would be there." Their plan was desperate. They would wait until the darkest point of the night, just before dawn, when the guards would be at their drowsiest. Mrs. Higgins would create a diversion, setting a small, contained fire in a distant hay barn. While the entire estate was distracted, she and Scarlett would slip out with shovels and a lantern and head for the grove. As they waited, the house was a tinderbox of tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, sounded like Blaze returning. They were two women against a king in his castle. Finally, the time came. Mrs. Higgins gave Scarlett a firm, reassuring look, then slipped out of the room. A few minutes later, a faint orange glow appeared in the distance, followed by muffled shouts. The diversion had begun. "Now," Mrs. Higgins whispered, appearing back at the door. "Go." They ran through the darkened house, out the kitchen door, and into the night. The air was cool and smelled of smoke. In the distance, they could see the flames from the hay barn leaping into the sky. Men were shouting, running with buckets. No one saw them as they melted into the shadows, shovels in hand, heading towards the dark, silent pecan grove at the edge of the property. The grove was a tangled mess of thorns and shadows. The lantern cast dancing, demonic shapes on the gnarled tree trunks. For what felt like hours they searched, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. They dug at any spot that looked disturbed, their shovels hitting nothing but rocks and roots. Despair was beginning to set in. Blaze would be back soon. The fire wouldn't distract them forever. "Here," Scarlett said suddenly, her voice hushed. She was pointing the lantern at the base of the largest, oldest pecan tree. The ground there was slightly sunken, and a small, flat, unmarked fieldstone was half buried in the dirt. It looked almost like a forgotten headstone. They began to dig. The earth was soft, easier to turn than elsewhere. Their shovels struck something hard with a sickening, hollow thud. It wasn't a rock, it was wood. Working frantically, they cleared the dirt away, revealing the rotted lid of a simple wooden coffin. With a final, desperate heave, they pried it open. Scarlett held the lantern over the opening, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. Inside, among the dirt and decayed fabric, lay a skeleton. And around the skeletal neck, glinting in the lantern light, was the delicate silver chain of a locket. It was the identical twin of the one Blaze had taken from her room. Her mother's locket. They had found her. They had the proof. A twig snapped behind them. They both spun around, their blood turning to ice. Standing at the edge of the grove, his face illuminated by their lantern, his eyes burning with a murderous rage, was Blaze. And in his hand, he held a hunting rifle, its barrel aimed directly at Scarlet's heart. "I knew you'd come here," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Like mother, like daughter, always digging where you don't belong." He took a slow step forward, the rifle steady in his hands. The fire in the distance was dying down. The shouts were fading. No one would hear the shot. No one would even know they were gone. He would simply bury 2 more bodies in his secret graveyard. "You should have run when you had the chance," Blaze sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's over, Blaze," Mrs. Higgins said, stepping in front of Scarlet, shielding her. "We know everything. We found her." "You found nothing," he spat. "Just a box of old bones. Your word against mine. Now step aside, old woman, or I'll put you in the ground with them." But Mrs. Higgins didn't move. She stood her ground, a frail but unmovable wall of defiance. In that moment, Scarlet saw a flicker of movement in the trees behind Blaze, a second shadow detaching itself from the darkness. Her mind screamed, assuming it was one of Blaze's overseers, coming to help him. They were truly finished. "You won't be burying anyone tonight." The voice was calm, cold, and unfamiliar. It came from the shadows. Blaze spun around, his rifle swinging towards the sound. The figure stepped into the faint lantern light. It was a man, tall and dressed in dark riding clothes, his face hard and weathered, and in his hand he held a pistol, aimed squarely at Blaze's chest. "Who the hell are you?" Blaze roared, momentarily confused. The man smiled, a grim, humorless expression. "You don't recognize me, do you? It's been a long time." He took another step forward. "My name is Silas Blackwood." The world stopped. Scarlet stared, her mind refusing to comprehend. Silas? Her uncle? But he was dead. The newspaper clipping, the riding accident, Blaze's confession. "That's impossible," Blaze stammered, his own face a mask of disbelief. "You're dead. I saw you fall." "You saw me fall," Silas corrected, his voice like ice. "You never saw me die. You left me for dead at the bottom of that ravine, with a broken leg and a cracked skull. You were always a coward, Blaze. Never one to finish a job." He explained how he'd been found by a traveling doctor, how he'd spent years recovering, his name and identity a secret. He had been planning his revenge, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had been watching the house for weeks. He was the one who had poisoned Blaze, a slow-acting poison from South America, hoping to draw out the truth in a fever. He had been watching tonight, had seen the fire, seen the women run to the grove. "You took my sister from me," Silas said, his voice raw with a decade of hatred. "You locked her away and drove her to her death. And you tried to kill me. Tonight, I collect on that debt." Suddenly the situation had been turned on its head. This wasn't a rescuer. This was an executioner. Scarlet was standing between 2 murderers, one past, one present, both consumed by their own hatred. Blaze, realizing he was trapped, made a desperate move. He swung his rifle back towards Scarlet. "Drop your gun, Blackwood!" he yelled, "or the girl dies first!" But Silas just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Go ahead," he said, his pistol never wavering from Blaze's chest. "She means nothing to me. She's just a loose end. Once you're dead, she's next." Scarlet was frozen in a nightmare. She was a pawn in a game of monsters. There was no justice to be found here. Only more death, more violence. As Blaze hesitated, torn between his targets, Mrs. Higgins did something no one expected. With a cry of rage, the old housekeeper lunged forward, not at Blaze, but at the lantern. She kicked it over, plunging the entire grove into absolute, terrifying darkness. A shot rang out, then another. A scream tore through the night, and then silence. The sudden darkness was a disorienting, terrifying blanket. Scarlet dropped to the ground, her hands over her head, her heart hammering against the dirt. The shots had been deafeningly loud, followed by that terrible cut-off scream. Who had been hit? Who was still standing? She could hear nothing but the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears and the distant crackle of the dying fire. A minute passed. An eternity. Then a voice, hoarse and strained, cut through the silence. "Scarlett? Mrs. Higgins?" It was Blaze. Slowly, shakily, Scarlett pushed herself up. "I'm here," she whispered. "Mrs. Higgins?" "Here," came the housekeeper's voice, surprisingly steady from nearby. A match scraped against stone, and a tiny flame flickered to life. Blaze was holding it, his hand trembling. In the small, dancing light, she saw the scene. Mrs. Higgins was on her feet, unharmed. Blaze was standing, but he was clutching his arm, a dark stain spreading through his shirt sleeve. And on the ground, a few feet away, lay Silas Blackwood, a pistol still clutched in his hand, his eyes wide and unseeing, a dark hole in the center of his chest. Blaze had shot him. But not before Silas had gotten a shot off himself, hitting Blaze in the arm. In the chaos, in the darkness, Blaze's aim had been truer. He stared down at the body of his old rival, his enemy, the man he thought he had killed 10 years ago. There was no triumph on his face, only a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. The ghosts that had haunted him for a decade were finally real, and the confrontation had left him broken. He looked at Scarlett, his eyes filled with a universe of regret. "He was right," Blaze said, his voice a ragged whisper. "I was a coward. I let him fall. I was so terrified he would take Alara from me, I ran. I told myself it was an accident. I told myself that for 10 years. He sank to his knees, the pain from his arm and the weight of his guilt finally crushing him. "And your mother, I did bring her back here. I thought I could make her love me again. I thought I could protect her. But I was a monster. My obsession, my jealousy. It was a cage. I didn't kill her, Scarlett. But I drove her to it. I am as guilty as if I had pulled the trigger myself." This was the true confession. Not the delirious ramblings of a sick man, but the clear, sober words of a man whose world had completely crumbled. He had finally admitted the truth, not just to her, but to himself. They stood there in the silent grove, over 2 graves, one old, one new. The cycle of violence was finally over, but the wreckage remained. They never called the sheriff. As Mrs. Higgins had said, it would do no good. They buried Silas Blackwood next to his sister in the dark, without a prayer. A secret piled upon a secret. Blaze, his arm crudely bandaged by Mrs. Higgins, worked alongside them, his movements slow and pained. It was his penance. In the days that followed, the great house was quieter than ever before. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the tense, menacing silence of before, but the hollow, aching silence of grief. Blaze was a changed man. The anger was gone. The pride was gone. All that was left was a hollow shell, filled with regret. He confined himself to his study, not as a king in his castle, but as a prisoner in his cell. Scarlett and Mrs. Higgins ran the house. They were the survivors, the keepers of the terrible secret. A strange, unspoken bond had formed between them. They were the only 2 people in the world who knew the truth of what lay buried in the pecan grove. Scarlett knew she should leave. There was nothing for her here but ghosts and painful memories. But she couldn't. Something held her there. It wasn't forgiveness. What Blaze had done was unforgivable. But looking at the broken man, a man who had finally been forced to face the monster in his own soul, she felt something else. A flicker of the compassion she'd once had. Not for the powerful Baron, but for the man stripped of everything. Her faith taught her about redemption, but she had never imagined it would look like this. So ugly, so painful. One evening, a month after that terrible night, he sent for her. She found him in the study, staring out the window, just as he had been when she first arrived. "I am selling the house," he said, not turning to look at her. "The land, everything, the money, half of it is yours. It's not payment and it's not an apology, because there are no words or amounts that could ever atone for what I did. Think of it as restitution, your inheritance." He finally turned to face her. "The other half, I will use to disappear. I'll go somewhere no one knows my name. And I will live out my days with my actions as my only companions." He was giving it all up. The fortress he had built his life around. He was finally letting it go. He was choosing exile over his kingdom. He slid a deed across the desk. "This property, however," he said, his voice soft. "The pecan grove. It is yours. It belongs to the Blackwood family. It is the only thing I can truly give back." Scarlett looked at the man before her. She saw the journey he had taken, from cruel tyrant to broken penitent. He was offering her the only justice he could. He was destroying himself to pay his debt. She walked over to the desk, picked up the pen, and signed the papers, claiming her family's land. She did not take the money. She did not want his blood money. She wanted only this small piece of earth. A place to properly bury her mother and uncle. A place to finally let the ghosts rest. As he prepared to leave, a week later, with only a single bag, he found her in the garden. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I will stay," she said. "I will bring my mother home. I will give her a proper stone. I will make this place a place of peace, not secrets." He nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "Alara, she was a gardener," he said softly. "She would have liked that." He turned to walk away, a man walking into a future of his own making, a lonely path of atonement. But before he left the garden, he stopped and turned back one last time. "Scarlett," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." She didn't answer. She simply watched him go, the once powerful cotton baron, now just a man, walking away from the ruins of his life, leaving her behind to build a new one. The story wasn't over. The pain was still there. But for the first time, in the quiet garden of that great haunted house, she felt a glimmer of hope. It was a new beginning, born from the ashes of a terrible end. The great house stood on the hill, but it was no longer a tomb. Under Scarlett's care, it began to change. With Mrs. Higgins by her side, they began the slow, arduous process of letting the light in. They packed away the heavy, dark drapes. They opened the windows, letting fresh air chase out the stale memories. The house began to breathe again. Scarlett used what little money she had saved to hire a stonemason from the town. They brought her mother and her uncle from the grove and reburied them in the family plot behind the small village church. She gave them proper headstones, with their names, Alara and Silas Blackwood, carved deep and clear. She planted roses on their graves. It was a final, quiet act of love and justice, a reclamation of the truth. News of Blaze's sudden departure and the transfer of the estate to his former maid was the talk of the county. Rumors flew, but no one knew the dark, bloody truth of it. To the outside world, it was just another eccentricity of the strange cotton baron. Scarlett let them talk. The secrets of that house were hers now, and she would keep them. She found she was a natural at running the estate. She had watched Blaze, learned the rhythms of the planting and the harvest. But she ran it differently. She treated the workers with kindness and respect. She learned their names, their families. The atmosphere of fear that had choked the plantation for years slowly dissipated, replaced by one of loyalty and hard work. The land, free from the weight of its master's sins, seemed to flourish. But the house was still lonely. The echoes were gone, but the silence remained. One day, while sorting through the last of Blaze's abandoned belongings in the study, she found the rosewood box. He had left it behind. She opened it. Inside, where the locket and clipping had once been, was a single folded piece of paper. It was a letter, in his handwriting, addressed to her. "Scarlett," it read. "If you are reading this, it means you have stayed. I did not expect you to. I did not deserve for you to. I have no right to ask you for anything, but I will ask this. Do not let the story of this house be one of hatred. Let my evil die with me. Build something good on this land. Find happiness here. It is the only redemption I can imagine." She folded the letter, a strange mix of emotions churning within her. He was gone, but he was still a part of this place. A ghost she couldn't quite exorcise. Months turned into a year. The seasons changed. Scarlett grew into her role as mistress of the estate. She was respected, admired, but she was alone. The trauma of what she had endured had built its own walls around her heart, not of pride, but of fear. She kept her distance, trusting no one but Mrs. Higgins. One day, a young lawyer from the town rode up to the house. His name was Samuel, and he had been hired by Blaze's attorneys to finalize some of the last lingering details of the estate transfer. He was kind, intelligent, with a gentle smile and honest eyes. He was not intimidated by her position. He was simply impressed by what she had accomplished. He started finding excuses to return, to ask her questions about the accounts, to offer his advice. Slowly, cautiously, Scarlett found herself looking forward to his visits. They would walk through the gardens, and she would tell him about her plans for the next season's crop. He listened, truly listened, with an open heart. He was the polar opposite of Blaze. He was light where Blaze had been darkness. He was gentle where Blaze had been cruel. One evening, as they sat on a bench watching the sunset, he took her hand. "Scarlett," he said softly, "I know people talk. They wonder about you. But I don't care about the rumors. I only see the strong, kind, brilliant woman who has taken a place of sorrow and made it beautiful again. I have come to care for you very deeply." Fear warred with a longing she had suppressed for years. She pulled her hand away. "You don't know my story," she whispered. "The real story of this place." "Then tell me," he said simply. And so she did. She told him everything. About her mother, Alara. About Silas. About the diary, the fever, the confession, the night in the grove. She expected him to be horrified, to look at her with pity or fear, to get up and leave. When she finished, tears streaming down her face, he simply took her hand again, his grip firm and steady. "You have survived a nightmare," he said, his voice filled with awe. "And you have not become a part of it. You have risen above it. It doesn't frighten me, Scarlett. It makes me admire you even more." In that moment, the last wall around her heart crumbled. She had found a man who could see all of her, the darkness and the light, and was not afraid. A man who could help her build a new future, not on the ashes of the past, but alongside them. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the garden of the great house. The whole town came to celebrate the woman who had become their friend and leader. Mrs. Higgins stood by her side, her face beaming with pride. As Scarlett said her vows to Samuel, she felt the last of the old ghosts finally recede. This was her house now, her life, her story to write. Years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls that had once known only silence. Scarlett and Samuel had built a family, a life filled with love and warmth. The estate was one of the most prosperous in the state, known for its fairness and its innovation. One afternoon, Scarlett was sitting on the porch with her eldest daughter, a girl with her grandmother Alara's kind eyes. She was telling her a story, not the dark, true story, but a simpler one, about a lonely house that was saved by a little bit of kindness. A dusty, travel-worn man on a tired horse rode up the long drive. He was old now, his hair gray, his shoulders stooped. He stopped his horse at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. His eyes were faded, but she knew them instantly. It was Blaze. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her daughter, at the house that was so full of life. He saw the happiness he had written about in his letter. He saw the redemption he had prayed for. A small, sad smile touched his lips, He gave a single slow nod, a gesture of peace, of acknowledgement. Then he turned his horse and rode away, disappearing back into the dust from whence he came, a ghost, finally letting go. Scarlet watched him until he was gone, then turned back to her daughter. She had found her justice, not through revenge, but through living. By building a life of love and light on the very ground that had once held so much darkness, she had triumphed. Her mother's story had a new ending. If you were moved by Scarlet's journey from a hunted orphan to a pillar of strength and forgiveness, don't forget to like and subscribe. Her story is a powerful reminder that even after the deepest betrayals, it's possible to rebuild, to find love, and to create a new legacy, not of vengeance, but of grace. Join our community for more stories that explore the incredible resilience of the human spirit. We'll see you next time.